These are the notes for Chapter 18, Section 1, Origins of the Cold War. Feel free to pause the video at any time to take notes, or you can rewind the video if you missed something that I said. So hopefully this will help guide you through the notes. Here we go. So as we learned in the World War II unit, Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945. So his vice president at the time, Harry Truman, became the new president. Now, Truman was only the vice president for Roosevelt's fourth term, so he didn't have a ton of experience in office. So a lot of Americans doubted that he was really able to run this country that all of a sudden was under his control. But luckily, he was honest, confident, and he was willing to make the tough decisions that he would need to make in the next few months. So, although a lot of Americans doubted him, he did appear up for the task. Truman's first big meeting as this new president was the Potsdam Conference. So he went and met with Winston Churchill of Great Britain and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. This was the final wartime conference of the Big Three at the very end of World War II. And at this conference, Truman really pushed Joseph Stalin, to allow the countries of Eastern Europe to have free, democratic, open elections. And Stalin wasn't really going for this. He had a different plan for the countries of Eastern Europe, and this is kind of when Truman realized that they had very different goals for the world, and they were probably going to face some struggles in the years to come as the leaders of the US and the Soviet Union. So, as I said, the US and Soviet Union did end up having very different goals for Europe. So, under President Truman, the United States had like 4 main goals. So, they really wanted to encourage democracy. They thought that democracy was the best way for countries to run, and they wanted to encourage democracy in other countries to prevent the rise of totalitarian governments. As we learned in the World War II units, those were the governments that came to power and kind of set off World War II. So the US had a goal of encouraging democracy to prevent those types of events happening again. The second goal of the US was to gain access to raw materials and markets. So the US has these booming industries after World War II, and like we learned in the imperialism unit, they want to have more places to get materials from and sell their products in. So they had a goal of kind of not necessarily controlling the countries of Europe, but having enough influence there that they could sell their products there and get materials from there. The third goal of the US was to rebuild European governments. So after World War II, as we saw, a lot of the fighting that happened was in Europe, and a lot of the countries were kind of destroyed after the war. We saw in Saving Private Ryan how France was getting bombed and the cities in France were like almost completely destroyed. So the US wanted to make sure that they helped rebuild those countries so that they kind of had their foot in the door in those countries and they could create markets in those countries and sell American goods there. So they really wanted to help rebuild those governments, get them strong again, and then hopefully have a trading relationship with them. And lastly, they really wanted to reunite Germany. The US saw Germany as kind of a center in Europe that if they're not stable, then Europe's not going to be very stable. So they had the hope that reuniting Germany would help Europe be more stable, and hopefully that way Germany wouldn't be as bitter about losing in the war if they're doing well as a country. If Germany's just divided and struggling, then they're probably going to be bitter about their loss in World War II, and that could lead to future problems. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, had some pretty different goals. They had a goal of encouraging communism in other countries. So we'll learn on the next slide more of what communism is, but basically they believe that there's this worldwide struggle between the working class who doesn't have as much money and then the wealthy who kind of makes money off of the working class. So the Soviet Union believed that communism was a way to get rid of that struggle between the working class and the wealthy, and they really wanted to encourage communism in other countries. They also wanted to gain industrial equipment from Eastern European countries because they saw this as a way to rebuild their own country after the war. The Soviet Union was pretty broken after World War II, and they thought that gaining industrial equipment from Eastern European countries would help them rebuild themselves. So they kind of wanted to use these countries to rebuild. They also had a goal of controlling Eastern Europe because the US had quite a big influence in Western Europe. So the Soviet Union wanted to kind of balance that and make sure that they established their control in the eastern part of Europe so that the US didn't end up with full control. And they also had the opposite goal of the US in the fact that they wanted to keep Germany divided and weak, because in World War II, well, in World War I and World War II, the Soviet Union Germany waged war on the Soviet Union in both of those wars and were responsible for millions and millions of Soviet deaths. So naturally, the Soviet Union doesn't want Germany to get strong again because they don't want to risk this happening again. They don't want to give Germany the opportunity to be strong enough to potentially wage war on the Soviet Union again and cause more Soviet deaths. So, while the US wanted to reunite Germany and keep them strong, the Soviet Union really wanted to keep them divided and weak. So, as we see, their goals for Europe were pretty opposite, and this is going to cause some problems. As I mentioned, there's some differences between democracy, or which is typically capitalism is related to democracy, and communism. So in capitalism, there's two major social classes. There's the working class, who works to survive, makes up a large majority of the population. When there's a big business, the working class are the people who make that business run, while the capitalist class are the people who own those businesses. So they're the minority. They are the minority portion of the population which earns profits from employing the working class. So the capitalist class would be the people who own the big businesses, and then the working class works for them and basically makes profits for the capitalist class. So in communism, they feel that there's a struggle between the working class and the capitalist class, and to try to get rid of that struggle, communism is a type of society or economic system where there's no private ownership of businesses. So it gets rid of that wealthy capitalist class that owns the businesses and makes money off of the working class. In communism, there's no private ownership, there's only common ownership, typically by the government, and then free access to all goods and services. So all people have the same access to goods and services. They aren't restricted based on how much money they have, what they can afford. So there's no class system in communism. There's no rich and poor and middle class. everyone's kind of on an even playing field in communism. So after, like I said, the Soviet Union was severely damaged in World War II, and they felt pretty vulnerable that before they are able to rebuild, they could be attacked again by the US. So they felt the need to gain some friendly neighbors that could have their back, but also that they could grow from. So Stalin propped up satellite nations, is what they were called. And these were communist governments in surrounding countries which became dependent upon and dominated by the Soviet Union. So these satellite nations were those pink countries that you see around the Soviet Union: Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. And they were supposed to be meant as kind of like friendly neighbors that are protecting the Soviet Union from the West, but they were also used by the Soviet Union to rebuild the Soviet Union. So they would go into those countries and take materials and industrial products from those countries and use them in the Soviet Union to rebuild their own country. And Stalin was also worried that another war was pretty much inevitable. There was going to be a World War III. So he began building up the Soviet military forces as well. So in class, we just had a little discussion about what problems might arise with the Soviet Union creating these satellite nations. So something to consider here is, do we think that those countries, those 6 countries there, are happy about being controlled by and dependent upon the Soviet Union? Do we think they're happy that the Soviet Union is taking materials from them to rebuild their own country? And basically going in and propping up communist governments there, so they're not allowing those countries to choose their own type of government. So we can probably anticipate that this is going to create some problems amongst the satellite nations and the Soviet Union. So the US decided the Soviet Unions are spreading their influence of communism. We need to try to find a way to stop this. So in February 1946, an American diplomat named George Kennan proposed a policy of containment. So this was an effort by the US to basically stop the spread of communism, to block the Soviet influence in the world, and kind of slow their ability to spread communism. They've already done so in Poland and Romania and those areas around them in the satellite nations. So containment was a policy where the US would focus on trying to stop this spread and hope that it wouldn't spread to any other countries. And in order to encourage this policy of containment, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Great Britain, he came to the United States and gave a speech called the Iron Curtain speech and explained what was happening in Europe. So he was trying to explain to people that there's this Iron Curtain, this white line that's descended across Europe, and the Soviet Union is kind of dividing Europe by spreading their communist influence, and we need to focus on this policy of containment to prevent the Soviet Union from spreading any farther. So he kind of came over from Europe to explain this to the US and encourage the US to devote themselves to this policy of containment. And when Stalin heard of this speech, he kind of declared this as like a call to war, basically saying, okay, you are pretty much establishing that you and the United States are against me in the Soviet Union, and this is pretty much a call to war between our countries.
In the spring of 1946, Winston Churchill traveled to the United States. He tried to shock Americans out of their complacency. In a speech at Fulton, Missouri, carried on radio, he warned them how the Soviets were acting in Europe.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Budapest. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere.
Churchill's vivid picture of a continent divided by an iron curtain helped change the public mood. Once, the press had portrayed an alliance of three equals. Now, Uncle Joe was turned into a scheming despot, forcing whole countries into submission. From the East, Soviet cartoonists responded in kind. These crude caricatures were part of a new type of war, in which governments taught whole populations to demonize the other.
So as that video explained, this policy of containment and the Iron Curtain speech kind of led to, well, along with just the conflicting views in general of the United States and the Soviet Union, led to the Cold War. So this is kind of a confusing concept, but the Cold War is the state of hostility between the US and the Soviet Union that did not include direct military action, but dominated the policies of the US and the world for a long period of time. So while it is called a war, it's called the Cold War because there wasn't actually any direct military action. It's kind of just the disagreement between the two countries, which influenced the policies of the two countries and the actions that the two countries took around the world. So as I mentioned, we'll have a discussion in class, but this period is pretty much just referred to as the Cold War because it's a time of hostility between major world powers, but it's not a time of actual military action. So we're not going and bombing the Soviet Union at this time. We're not having troops on the ground, but we are in a disagreement, and that's influencing the way that each side acts and the things that they do. So the US created some different containment efforts to try to contain communism. So one way that the US did this was through the Truman Doctrine, which was a policy saying that the US should provide support to any countries threatened by internal or external communism. And this policy was used and provided Greece and Turkey with $400 million in economic and military aid. So by the US providing them money and economic and military support, this prevents the Soviet Union from going in and setting up a communist government and taking over. And a similar situation was the Marshall Plan, which was proposed by Secretary of State George Marshall. And this said that the United States would provide aid to all European countries that needed it. His exact words were that it would help fight hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. But it was largely a plan created to build up these countries of Europe who were hungry and in poverty, but we wanted to build them up and make them stronger, ultimately so that they wouldn't be weak and be taken over by the Soviet Union. So the Marshall Plan provided $12.5 billion to rebuild these European countries and make sure that they were strong enough so they weren't being taken over by communism.
In March of 1947, President Harry Truman delivered a speech regarding the potential fate of two nations, Greece and Turkey. Both were experiencing economic and political turmoil, and Truman concluded that the U.S. should do everything within its power to assist these nations. He feared that if Greece and Turkey were left to their own accord, they would become communist states. Truman believed communism must be halted and not allowed to spread to other nations. Many feel that this speech was the beginning of what became known as the Cold War. It effectively established the Truman Doctrine as America's policy towards communism. The Truman Doctrine was a policy of containment. This suggested that the U.S. would not try to eliminate communism, but instead simply confine it to the nations where communism already existed. The reason for the containment policy was known as the domino theory. Foreign policy experts believed that if one nation in a region fell to communism, nearby nations would fall as well, similar to dominoes falling upon each other. Financial aid to Greece and Turkey was one of the first actions of the Truman Doctrine policy. The two nations were given more than $400 million to help rebuild their economy and firmly establish their government. However, this was just the beginning. In 1948, the U.S. began assisting other nations in Western Europe. The Marshall Plan, named after Secretary of State George Marshall, was a monetary assistance program. Over the course of 4 years, the nations of Western Europe were given more than $12 billion to aid in rebuilding after the widespread destruction of World War II. This was done in the hopes that it would help these nations resist communism and prevent them from falling under Soviet influence.
So I want us to consider how policies like the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan could potentially be problematic for the U.S. I mean, we just explained that $400 million was given to Greece and Turkey, and $12.5 billion was given to countries of Europe to rebuild. So this is a lot of money that the U.S. is giving out, but also it's kind of tying us into those countries and just getting us further and further into this Cold War with the Soviet Union, where we're supporting more and more countries, and this could kind of be seen as a threat to the Soviet Union in a lot of ways. So let's look at Germany now. So after World War II, as you see in this map here, Germany was split into 4 zones. So this top green zone was held by Great Britain. This blue zone was controlled by France. And then this orange zone is controlled by the US. And the top zone, the red zone up here, is the Soviet Union. So, as we mentioned in the chart, the US was very interested in reuniting Germany and making sure that it can be rebuilt and stronger and productive so that it's a strong force in Europe and not an area where the Soviet Union can spread its influence more. However, on the other side, the Soviet Union really wanted to keep Germany weak and divided. It didn't want Germany to have a chance to attack them again and kill a large portion of the Soviet Union. So the 4 sections of Germany were not in agreement on what they wanted to do. In 1948, the Allies, so Great Britain, France, and the US, decided that they would recombine their 3 western zones into one territory. So these 3 areas were combined in 1948 and become one territory, while the Soviet Union is still controlling East Germany. The Soviet Union was not happy about this and was not going to simply stand by and let it happen, so the Soviet Union decides to retaliate. So the tricky part of this division is there are these 3 divisions on this side with the United States, France, and Great Britain, but also the city of Berlin, the capital of Germany, is also divided into these 4 zones. So East Berlin over here, the yellow part, is controlled by the Soviet Union, but the orange half is controlled by French, British, and the United States. So this is like a blown up version of Berlin here, which, as you see, is surrounded by the Soviet Union zone of Germany. So the Soviet Union takes this opportunity to hold West Berlin hostage, so they cut off all highway, water, and rail traffic to West Berlin. So they basically create a blockade holding West Berlin hostage, which is kind of easy for them to do when they control the entire region around Berlin. And they hoped that doing this and holding West Berlin hostage, which was technically a French, British, and American zone, would cause the Allies to give up their idea of reunifying Germany. However, it didn't work for them. In response to this blockade, America and Great Britain started the Berlin airlift. So you see here, there's an airplane. They began flying food and supplies into West Berlin for 327 days. So the Soviet Union could stop rail traffic, water traffic, and highway traffic, but they couldn't stop the planes from flying over West Berlin and dropping goods to the people. So they persisted for 327 days to bring support and food and supplies to West Berlin. So the Soviet Union finally realized it was beaten, and they gave up. They lifted the blockade, and the people of West Berlin were no longer held hostage. The Berlin blockade, however, did increase fear of Soviet aggression. People around the world began to see what the Soviet Union was capable of. They held a portion of a capital city hostage for almost an entire year. So people began to be concerned about what the Soviet Union was capable of. And this led to the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. And NATO is a defensive military alliance between the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European countries. So in this alliance, all the countries agree that an attack on one country would be an attack on all countries. So this potentially could lead to another world war if, say, Canada is attacked by the Soviet Union, then the United States and all the 10 Western European countries have promised that they will back up Canada and they will fight the Soviet Union. This is pretty significant because this is the first time in history that the US entered into a military alliance during peacetime. Now, I know this is confusing because we just said that the Cold War is going on, but this is still considered a peacetime because there's no boots on the ground. We're not actively fighting in the Soviet Union. So technically an alliance wouldn't necessarily be needed, but I think the world was so concerned that a war was going to break out. So the US joined this military alliance kind of precautionary to make sure that they had support if an actual military conflict did break out between them and the Soviet Union.
The guns of World War II had barely cooled when a new conflict threatened to rock Europe. This time around, it was the Western democracies, like Great Britain and France, and their ally across the pond, the United States, versus the Soviet Union and its communist satellites. These two sides each formed their own security agreements to show they meant business. These were NATO and the Warsaw Pact. After the war, the Soviet Union began to flex its muscles, installing communist governments in Eastern Europe. In 1948, the USSR toppled a democratic government in Czechoslovakia and then cut off supply routes to West Berlin. The United States and its Western European allies began to get nervous. You see what's going on over there with the Soviets? We don't like that, okay? In April 1949, foreign ministers of a dozen Western European and Northern American nations met in Washington, D.C. to sign the North Atlantic Treaty. This created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. In Article 5 of the treaty, NATO nations agreed that an attack against any of them by, say, the Soviet Union, for example, would be an attack against all of them. Original NATO nations sound off. Belgium, Denmark, Great Britain, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Canada, and the United States. Greece and Turkey joined in 1952, and West Germany in 1950.
And that is all we have for Chapter 18, Section 1. I hope this was helpful.